in order to understand how the Australian legal system is implemented, it's important to realize how the court system operates in Australia. So the purpose of this video will be to explain the court system in Australia, the division between state courts and federal courts, and then we'll have a look at the court hierarchy. So this is the image that summarizes the structure of government in Australia. The Australian Constitution decides or um, divides power into three branches. So the legislative power, and that's the House of Representatives and the Senate. You also have your um, executive power, and that's vested in the Governor General. And then you have the judicial power, which is the High Court of Australia, federal courts, and state courts. So what I'll be focusing on is the judiciary branch of this government. So in Australia, the judiciary is an independent form of government. There's no interference from the other arms of government. So there's no interference from the parliament or the executive. And that's, again, that relates to the doctrine of separation of powers. Chapter 3 of the Australian Constitution empowers Parliament to create federal courts and to vest federal judicial power in state courts. So in terms of the classifications of the courts that we have in Australia, you can either have federal courts or state courts. Let's first look at the federal court system. So in Australia, the federal court system is composed of these four courts that you see in front of you. At the highest end of the hierarchy, so the highest level, is the High Court of Australia. And then you have the Federal Court of Australia, that's the second level. Third is the Family Court of Australia, and then you have the Federal Circuit Court of Australia. Now, what determines whether a matter is heard at a particular court relates to the nature of the matter, so the subject matter of the issue determines whether you go to the High Court or the Federal Court. Plus, in terms of how severe the issue is. So if there's an issue that can't be resolved by any of the courts, you go through an appeal system and eventually it reaches the High Court level where any decisions that are made are absolutely final. So final decisions that are made are ones that are made by the High Court of Australia. That's why in the High Court of Australia, it's considered as the highest court and the final court of appeal. And in terms of the matters that would be referred to the High Court, it's mostly matters related to the Constitution, as well as final appeals in civil and criminal matters from all courts in Australia. Now, remember when we talked about the classification of law, we said that we can either classify law as being civil or criminal related. So construction law would mostly be civil related. Criminal law is where you're looking at issues where there's murder involved, etc. So we won't be focusing a lot on that in the course. But any issue that can't be resolved by the lower courts, usually it would go through an appeal process and it would eventually reach the High Court, and any decision that's made by the High Court is absolutely final. The second level of federal courts that we have in Australia is the Federal Court of Australia. Again, there's a range of subject matters that are heard in the court, so issues related to bankruptcy, corporations, industrial relations, and native title as well. Taxation is another issue that's heard by the federal court. And it also hears appeals from decisions of the Federal Circuit Court. So the Federal Circuit Court is a court which is lower than the federal court within that federal court system. So any appeals of decisions made in the Federal Circuit Court would be heard by the Federal Court of Australia. The third court that's within the federal system of courts is the Family Court of Australia. It's a specialist court, so any matters that are heard by the Family Court of Australia are related to family disputes and also appeals that are made from decisions in family law matters within the Federal Circuit Court. So the Federal Circuit Court is that lowest court level within that federal system of courts, and it's at the lowest level because in terms of the issues that it hears, it's usually less complex. Um, but in terms of the variety of issues, there's a lot of issues that can be heard at the Federal Circuit Court of Australia. So, family law, child support, admin law, any laws related to bankruptcy as well, if they're not massive in value. Um, copyright issues, that's all covered by the Federal Circuit Court of Australia. So that basically covers the federal court system in Australia. But as I said, there's another branch or another type of court systems, and that's the state courts. So in this course, I would just be focusing on the New South Wales state court system. So Victoria has a separate state court system as well, but in New South Wales, usually it's the well, not usually, but it's the way it is that the Supreme Court of New South Wales is at the highest level. So you can think of the Supreme Court of New South Wales as being the equivalent of the High Court within the state. And then we have the District Court, which is one level below the Supreme Court, and then you have the local courts, which is even further below the hierarchy, and then we have specialist courts. So if I was to just briefly explain, some of the issues or the matters that would be heard in the District Court of New South Wales, you're looking at civil matters that are between $100,000 to $750,000. Any motor-related accidents would also be resolved in that district court. So you'd imagine that a lot of construction-related um, disputes, if they're between $100,000 and $750,000, that's where you'd go, District Court of New South Wales. In terms of the local court, so it's where most civil matters are heard, and it's in terms of value, the civil claims would be up to $100,000. So if you've got a dispute which is up to $100,000 civil in nature, then you'd have your issue resolved at the local court. And then there's also specialist courts. And these specialist courts, examples of them include the Workers' Compensation Commission, the Land and Environment Court. So if you've got any issues related to, environmental breaches, that's the sort of court, the specialist court that you'd go to. And then you have the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal, and that's part of the specialist courts. Okay, so civil jurisdiction, and that's what we're interested in when we're talking about construction law. That's sort of the system, the hierarchy of courts that integrates, the state courts and the High Court of Australia, the federal court. So you've got your local courts, your local state courts. That's where you'd usually start, and then if the matter is not resolved, you'd go higher up in the court. If you've got any appeals, then it's the New South Wales Court of Appeal, and then eventually, if the matter is still not resolved, it it will end up at the High Court of Australia, and at that point, this is when a final decision will be made. The criminal jurisdiction as well, so issues that involve murder, it's similar in the sense that you start at the bottom of the chain and then you make your way up. But in terms of the number of courts that are available at the very bottom of the chain, it's a lot because different specialist courts that are involved depending on the nature of the criminal offense. But that's basically the structure. It ends up at the High Court, so the final decisions that are made by the High Court of Australia if it reaches that level. These are the references that I have used, and I do highly recommend that you check them out. Thank you very much.